We've been in a study of the book of Psalms, and as I mentioned before, if there's a particular psalm that you think that we ought to look at, then be sure to mention that to me, and we'll try to take the opportunity to look at some of those. But I thought we might take a little bit of time to look at some of the Psalms of David that have attached to them, some of them do, not all, an historical heading. And what's sort of unique about those is it allows us to sort of put ourselves in David's shoes, because we know a little bit about what David might have been going through at the point in time that he wrote that. A number of the Psalms were written, for example, at a time when David might have been on the run from Saul, and Saul's trying to kill him, even though David's done nothing to King Saul. There are other Psalms that are written when David is in the hands of the Philistines, or there may be a Psalm that's written when David is fleeing from his son Absalom. And because we're very familiar with David's life and the historical background, it allows us almost to transport ourselves back into thinking, I wonder how I would have felt at that moment in time. How would I have responded? And then we see David's response in the book of Psalm. So Psalm chapter 7 is a meditation of David, or your translation may have Shagayon, I don't know how you pronounce that out of the Hebrew language. It's a word that also occurs in Habakkuk chapter 3 and in verse 1. It might be a musical term. The best explanation that anybody has given is that the root word has to do with being highly emotional, and that these are psalms that are written that either express great joy or great sorrow, or maybe a mixture of the two. At the end of the day, the answer is, what does it mean? We don't know 100%. It's likely, again, a musical term that might have meant, according to Bedag, a wild, passionate song with rapid changes of rhythm. But it's a psalm of David, and this is a psalm of David that was sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjamite. Who's Cush? We don't know. There are a couple of explanations that are given. First of all, he's a Benjamite. Now, that's what we do know. And there are hundreds of Benjamites that were adversaries of David during his life. Why was that the case? What tribe was Saul from? He was a tribe of Benjamin. And so it's not a surprise at all that of the tribe of Benjamin that they would have aligned themselves with King Saul. And you see that in 1 Samuel through the book of 2 Samuel. Saul, Ishbosheth, Abner, Shimei, all of those are men that are of the tribe of Benjamin. There are about three different explanations that are given of Cush. One is that he is an unrecorded adversary of David in the historical books. He's not mentioned there. He's a guy named Cush, and he stood in opposition to David. I think that's the likely explanation. Some have suggested that it is a figurative description, and since the word Cush has to do with being black, that it describes a black-hearted individual, sort of a person of dark character, that had aligned themselves against David. And because some look at it from that standpoint, they even think that it's a description of Saul himself. I think the most likely explanation is that this is an ally, probably of King Saul, who has found himself an adversary of David. And as an adversary of David, he's made some false accusations against him. In fact, we could put here, it's a plea of deliverance from a false accuser. Somebody's made some accusations against David. Accusations that David said are not true. And he's asking and pleading with God to deliver me from these accusations. I think it's likely, and Dalix points this out in his commentary, that it takes place in the events of 1 Samuel 24 to 26, when David is fleeing from King Saul, and there are some accusations being made. Though we don't know the exact one in this text, it might be something like, do y'all know that David is trying to take the throne away from King Saul, and he's going to try to kill Saul in order to do it? Well, there wasn't any truth in that. But what would that do to a loyalist for King Saul? That would stir them up. It stirs up the enemies of the Lord. And so that is likely the type of accusation that is being made here in Psalm chapter 7. So in verses 1 through verse 5, we have this plea for help. What would you do in that circumstance? Being a godly individual doesn't mean accusations can't be made. Doesn't mean that things that are false may not be said against one in order to destroy their reputation. In fact, the Bible talks about when they speak against you as evil doers. Did they make accusations against the Lord? Yeah, cast out demons by the power of Beelzebub. John came and he didn't eat and he didn't drink, and they said, well, he's an oddball. And Jesus came and he ate and drank with the people. They said he's a glutton and a winebibber. There are all kinds of accusations that were made against godly people. How do you respond in that circumstance? Well, here's what David does. In verses 1 to verse 2, he said, O Lord my God, in you I put my trust. Save me from all those who persecute you and deliver me. Your translation may say, instead of in you I put my trust, in thee I find refuge. And that's really the better translation. If you take that word trust in the King James and the New King James Bible and you look it up, it's a word that means to take refuge in. What is a refuge? A place of safety. I don't know why I've always illustrated it in our day and time sort of this way, that a lot of us may have a storm shelter of some sort, that when the storm comes, where do you go? You go there, why? Safety. But if we were to ask this question, why do you go into that storm shelter? Ultimately, it's because you trust that what? That it's safe. You put your trust there that as long as I'm in there, what? No harm is going to befall me. So when we think about a city of refuge, under the Old Testament, if you had a criminal or if you had an individual that killed somebody accidentally and the family was after them, they ran to that city of refuge. They ran there because they trusted that when they got there, they were going to be safe. So that's the reason why I think the King James and the New King James translators translated it, in you I put my trust. It would be better translated as refuge, but the reason you go to a refuge is because that's where you put your trust. You're relying upon it. Save me, he said, from those who persecute you and deliver me, lest they tear me like a lion. Lions are not really plentiful at all in Israel now, but during the biblical days, they occupied that land of Palestine. And that illustration of a lion in his den or a hungry lion is really used throughout the Scriptures, particularly in the book of Psalms. And I take this probably to be a reference to the use of their tongue, that in their false accusation, it feels like David is what? Being torn apart. You ever been there where somebody might say something about, and you just feel like you're just being what? Ripped to shreds by the words and the accusations that are being made. So David begins in 1 and 2 by saying, in the midst of this, please offer me some deliverance. I feel like I'm being torn apart. Then in 3 to 5, David declares his innocence. Lord, if I've done this, and the if doesn't suggest that there's any doubt in David's mind. It's a declaration of innocence. It's very similar to what Job does in Job 31, in what we sometimes call the description of the ideal man. Like Job goes through there and he said, if I've done this, then let another pine for my wife. If I've done this, then let this happen. But it's Job's way of saying what? I haven't done any of those things. And so the psalmist David said, if I've done this, if there's iniquity in my hand, if I've repaid evil to him who was at peace for me, if I mistreated somebody for no reason at all, and I have plundered my enemy without cause. Some translations render that, the Old King James, yea, I have delivered him that without cause is mine enemy. And if that's the translation, Leopold argues it is, then the idea may be a reference to Saul, that not only had David not pursued him, but you know what David had done? He'd protected him. He'd delivered him. He had the opportunity more than once to take King Saul's life, and what did he do? He let him live. He gave up that opportunity. Maybe that's one reason the accusation hurt so much for David, is David realizes not only have I not mistreated Saul in any way, I've really gone out of my way to be kind to him. If I had done anything wrong, I'm not opposed to facing the consequences of my actions, but I'm innocent in all of this. And so in verse 3 through verse 5, he said, if I've done it, let my enemy trample and overtake me. Let him trample my life to the earth and lay my honor in the dust. But I haven't done any of those things. So Lord, in 6-13, what? Do something. Arise in judgment. Lord, one of the things you learn, one of the struggles that sometimes people have had with the Psalms, and this is not what I would consider to be one of the imprecatory Psalms that is just sort of beginning to end where David is saying, or the enemy saying, Lord, punish my enemies. And some have struggled with the plea of the psalmist to wipe out the wicked, to destroy my enemies. But one thing you realize in the Psalms is the psalmist never takes matters into his own hands. Where does he turn to? He turns to the Lord. He said, Lord, you take care of things. Lord, please, you arise in judgment. That's the faith of the psalmist, to just take things and what? And turn them over to the Lord. And so he said in verse 6, arise, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up because of the rage of my enemies. Rise up for me to the judgment that you've commanded. Lord, I want you to act on my behalf. So the congregation of people shall surround you for their sakes, therefore return on high. That is, I take when he says return on high, Lord, show that you're the one what? In charge. It may be the setting and judgment. Judge them and show them that you're the one who in your principles are guiding this world, that you're the one that is in control. You judge the people and judge me according to my righteousness and according to the integrity within me. Lord, you know what kind of person I am. You know my character. Judge me accordingly. In other words, deliver me from this, please. Give me some relief from all of this. Then in verses 9-13, it's a plea for the wickedness to end. Let the wickedness of the wicked come to an end, but establish the just. Put an end to this prevalence of wickedness, and let the just what? Prevail. Because God, you know who's right and who's wrong. And I think that's what he means when he said in verse 9, the righteous God tests the hearts and minds. One thing I always hate is when somebody sits down. I hate it in marriage relationships. Somebody sits down and says, okay, Mike, we need help. Can you mediate or moderate or referee or whatever the case might be? And sometimes they'll start telling me, this happened, and well, that's not how I meant it. And I'm in a position where I can't always judge the hearts and the minds of men, and I'm not there to say this is what happened. You know who always knows everything? God does. I think it's David's way of saying, God, you know who's right and wrong. You know the kind of person I am because you test the hearts and you test the minds of men. You know what their motive is. You know they're lying. You know this accusation is false. And so my defense is you. It's really in verse 10, I think, as if he says to the Lord, I'm relying on you to take care of this. You're my defense. And it may also be suggesting that ultimately at the end of the day, the only one that really matters in terms of their evaluation is God. It really didn't matter what Cush said. It really didn't matter what Ishbosheth said or Saul said. The ultimate one that matters is who? It's God. And so you save the upright at heart, and I know that you're a just God. In fact, not only do I know you're a just God, I know that you are angry with the wicked what? Every day. You ever think sometimes you look at the world around you, things like wickedness is prevailing? You ever taken time to think about the precarious position that the wicked are in? God is angry with them what? Every day. When he sees his way being thwarted, when he sees God's way being disobeyed, I know you're angry with it. In fact, if he does not turn back, that is, if the wicked doesn't change, what's going to happen in verse 12? God is what? He's sharpening his sword, he's bending his bow, and he's getting it ready. What's the picture there? Justice. God's getting ready. God is going to judge. God's bow is ready at any moment in time to execute judgment on the wicked. He's prepared for himself instruments of death, and he makes his heirs into fiery shafts. God, I know, in spite of how things look right now, I know your attitude toward the wicked, and I know you've got the bow ready, what? To execute judgment. And so what you have is David's plea for help at his declaration of innocence, his plea for God to rise in judgment. And I know you're a just God. I know you're going to do what is right. I know your attitude toward the wicked. Please do it now, if you will. In 14 to 16, there's an interesting point that's made, and that is, when this judgment comes on the wicked, whose fault is it? It's the wicked. The wicked bring forth iniquity. He conceives trouble and brings forth falsehood. In other words, he creates in his mind, plots all kinds of wickedness and all kinds of evil. But he's pictured in verse 15 as an individual that makes a pit that they themselves have dug. They've dug a pit, and then what do? They fall into it. And the picture is that of who's responsible for their downfall. They are. They dug the pit. They're falling into it. And so nobody's to be blamed for their downfall but them. This is an illustration, by the way, that's found in Scriptures more than once. Go over just a couple of chapters. Psalm 9:15. Psalm 9:15. The nations have sucked down in the pit which they have made. In the net which they hid, their own foot's caught. And so a nation here is pictured as falling. Why did they fall? Well, they dug the pit, and then what? They fell into it. Tell you, if our nation falls at some point in time, you know whose fault it's going to be? It's going to be the pit we dug. You know, we dug the pit, and what? We'll fall into it. We set the trap by how we live our life. Psalm 57 and in verse 6. They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They've dug a pit before me, and into the midst of it they themselves have fallen. It reminds me of the story in the book of Esther of Haman that built the gallows and then what? Hung on the same gallows. The picture there is the wicked bring judgment on themselves. Nobody else does that. They do that for themselves. And then in verse 17, in the midst of this circumstance, if we are correct, all these false accusations are being made against David. David feels like he's being torn to shreds and his reputation is being ruined by what is said. And he turns it over to God and says, God, I want you to deliver me. I want you to judge me by my integrity. But in almost all the Psalms, even as you come through this struggle, it always ends with what? A resolve to pray. I will praise the Lord according to his righteousness and sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High. Now, I'm going to praise God because David knows ultimately God is going to vindicate him. So you've got this Psalm of David written probably 1 Samuel 24 to 26 when David's reputation is being attacked. How does David respond? Well, he doesn't respond by what? Taking matters into his own hands. He doesn't respond by killing Saul. He doesn't respond by trying to slander the one that has made the accusation against him. He deals with it by turning to the Lord and saying, I'm going to put my trust in you, what? To help me through, to deliver, to vindicate me. And I know ultimately the wicked are going to fall. Any comments or questions in Psalm 7 in that particular circumstance that David wrote this psalm?
So where did the heading come from?
Headings were attached at a very early time. They're not part of the inspired writing. But if you go back and you look at the earliest manuscripts, some of the earliest manuscripts available, obviously we don't have where David wrote the Psalms. They were attached at a very early time. And some people reject them, but really there's no reason to reject them because the ones that we are familiar with are accurate. You know, for example, it may be where it says a Psalm of David. And then we go to the New Testament and the New Testament writers say, well, that's a Psalm of David. You know, or David wrote this when. Or maybe you can even go back to the historical circumstance in Samuel and there's something similar. So they have proven to be highly accurate. So we do have to put a caveat there to them, but they have proven to be accurate and seem to fit the circumstance that they're typically tied to. Psalm 11. It's always been one of my favorite psalms. And there's not an historical circumstance given here for this psalm. Now, even though there's not an historical circumstance given, if this is a psalm of David, and we have every reason to believe it is, that's the heading, I think we could probably think about some circumstances in which it might have been written. What's going on in Psalm 11? What's the circumstance the psalmist finds himself in? Well, the wicked are after him. They've got their bow bent. We'll talk more about that in a moment. In verse 2, they make ready the arrow on the string, and they're trying to destroy the upright in heart. In fact, things are so bad, it seems, at the time that Psalm 11 is written, that what are the friends saying? Run. Hide. In fact, the foundation is already what? Been destroyed. There's nothing we can do. David, just run and just hide and get out of here. What circumstances in David's life do you think might fit well the writing of Psalm 11? It could fit with what? Absalom. It could well fit with Absalom. There was a time when his son Absalom tried to take the throne away. What did David have to do in the midst of that, by the way? He had to leave the city of Jerusalem for a period of time. Could it fit with Saul pursuing him? It well could fit with Saul pursuing him. So there's more than one circumstance into which Psalm 11 could have been written, but those are some. The title I have got put to this psalm is Faith Not Flight. Now here's how the psalm begins. Verse 1a, the psalmist said, "In you, the Lord, I put my trust." You know what that means? It's the same word for refuge. Okay, it's our word for refuge again. And that idea of a refuge is found again throughout the book of Psalms. Psalm 46 and in verse 1, God is our refuge, our strength, a very present help in trouble. You typically don't think about a refuge, do you, until times of trouble. Back when we had a storm shelter, never thought about it much until they said storms are coming through and we'd go out and see how much water's in it or can we clean it up and get it. But when things are going well, you don't always think about a refuge. A refuge is there for times of trouble. Now, I'm not suggesting that God's there only for times of trouble, but I am saying is when the Bible talks about God being a refuge, it's always in the context of some struggle, some difficulty that we're trying to receive some help from. And so in this circumstance, the psalmist says, I'm going to put my trust in you. I'm turning to you as my help in this circumstance. Because he said his friends were saying, in fact, the response is, how can you say, flee as a bird to your mountain? What does a bird do in times of trouble? Yeah. Yeah, he flees, he runs, I can remember when I was growing up, we'd go into the woods, early in the morning, and sometimes you'd get scared to death when you walked up on quail or something. Here they go. But, they don't stand. When they hear danger come, what do? They go. They flee. And the idea here is trying to avoid the trouble, flee, and it's really a sign of a lack of faith here. This fleeing is a bird to the mountain. And so the advice of the friends is flee. Not only do they say flee in verse 2, they say, for look, the wicked bend their bow. They make ready their arrow on their string. What would we say in our day and time? If we were writing this in 2024, what would we say? They've got their gun what? Loaded and cocked and their fingers on the trigger. They're ready to fire. That's what David is saying here. In other words, they've already got the arrow on the string and they're ready to shoot at any point in time. And so it's a time where the wicked are going after the upright and seemingly they're prevailing. In fact, he said in verse 3, this is the implication of the friends, there's really just nothing we can do about it. If the foundation be destroyed, what can the righteous do? In talking about that, Albert Barnes said the word foundations here refers to those things on which society rests and by which social order is sustained. The great principles of truth and righteousness that uphold society as the foundation on which an edifice rests upholds the building. In other words, if the foundation of society is destroyed, then what? Well, yeah, what can we do? There's no reason to stay and fight or stand. There's nothing we're going to be able to what? To do anything. So the righteous finds themselves in a position where there's nothing we can do to change anything anyway. So David just what? Just flee or just give up. Let me ask you a question. You ever feel like David felt in Psalm 1 and 2? I mean, in Psalm 11, 1 and 2. That you look around and you think, maybe if we talk about society, the foundation of society is what? It's crumbling. I mean, everything upon which, the values, the principles that society held to when you were growing up, even when I was growing up, what? They're gone. Seemingly the foundation has just been what? Eroded and crumbled, and at times it makes you want to just what? Just throw up your hands and just give up. And that's where David found it. And I think that's what David's friends were telling him to David, just pack up and leave. We're not going to change things. Nothing can be done. You might as well just run. And David is saying, how can I say that when my refuge is where? It's in the Lord. And so what allowed David in that circumstance to have that kind of faith? What allowed David to get through this period of time where he felt the foundation was being destroyed and still say, I'm going to turn to God and refuge? Well, you see this confidence of David in verse 4 through the remainder of the chapter. And it begins by saying in verse 4, the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth, well, I'm actually not quoting another verse, the Lord's throne is in heaven. When I think about the Lord being on his throne or being in his temple, what Bible book do you think of? I'll give you a hint, and I have two chances. It's a prophet that begins with, our three chances, that begins with the letter H. The prophet of Habakkuk. Do you remember in the book of Habakkuk that Habakkuk started out by telling God, the world is falling apart. You need to do something about the wickedness in Israel. It seems like wickedness is prevailing. Lord, do something. And God said, I'm going to do something. I'm going to send Babylon to come. And Habakkuk said what? Don't do that. You can't do that because they're worse than we are. I've sometimes said, put yourself in Habakkuk's shoes. It would be like today. We talk about it sometimes. Look at how wicked as a nation we become, the principles we hold to. You ever think, God, how long? You're going to have to do something about this. Well, if God came to us and said, okay, Mike, Todd, whoever, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to send North Korea. And our answer would be what? No. Do you know who they are? They're worse. Yeah, we're bad, but what? They're worse. That's where Habakkuk finds himself. I mean, he's in that circumstance. You know what God's answer is to him? What's the theme of Habakkuk? The just shall live, or the righteous shall live by faith. And the answer is, Habakkuk, I'm not asking you to understand everything. I am asking you what? To trust me. All of that leads up to the climax in Habakkuk 2 and in verse 20, where he said, the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silent before him. What is God telling Habakkuk? I've got this. I'm in control. You may not understand what I'm doing, but you're going to have to learn to what? Trust me. And when he said, let all the earth keep silence before him, I think the ultimate point, even to Habakkuk and even to us today, is we have to shut up our complaining about how things are being done and trust that God knows what? What he's doing. Trust God's providence and God's rule in this world. And I think here's what David is saying. Listen, let's take that, for example, that this was written during the days of Absalom. And Absalom, David had to flee. Absalom is laying with the concubines out in front of everybody. David's being mistreated. David said, you know who's still in charge? God is. God's still in his holy temple. God's throne is still in heaven. And I think that's something I need to be reminded of it as well. You know, I see a lot of Christians, I've said this to me before, that are just extremely frustrated, and rightfully so in our day and time. But one thing I think we have to remember, for example, we've got a presidential election coming up. I can't remember the day, the exact date of the I know early voting starts, I think, this week here in the state of Arkansas. And we probably have a preference as to who we'd want to win the election. But do you know who's going to be in charge on the Wednesday following the election day in November? God is. God's going to be on his holy temple. God's going to be in control. God's going to be in rule. You know what that allows me to do?
Just to be relaxed.
It allows me to, even at times when things don't go the way I want to, it allows me to deal with those things because God's my refuge and he's still on his throne and nobody's going to take that throne away from him. And so David says, you know what, you're saying flee, but you know what, I know that God is still what? God's still in charge. God's on his throne. I'm going to put my trust in God. Not only that, in verse 4b, he says that the Lord, his eyes behold, his eyelids test the sons of men. The Lord tests the righteous, but the wicked and the one who loves violence, his soul hates. I think what that means when he says God sees and God tests the sons of men is God is not blind to our situation or our struggle. You know, sometimes we're blind and ignorant of others' problems. I mean, that's just the reality of it because of a lack of knowledge. Maybe sometimes it's a lack of care, but I don't always know what others are going through. And yet I think what David is saying is God sees. You know what? God was aware of everything David was going through. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping eyes on the good and the evil. Proverbs chapter 15. And in verse in 3. Psalm 139 and verse 12. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines at the day, and the darkness and the light are both alike to you. In other words, what prevents God from seeing? Nothing. God sees all. His eyelids behold, and he tests the sons of men. So he knows what they're doing. God's not ignorant of wickedness that's taking place. Furthermore, he tests the righteous in verse 5. But the wicked and the one who loves violence, his soul hates. I think maybe one point of that is that, does God test us as righteous people? He does. Sometimes, how does he test us? Through adversity, through difficulty. And maybe there's a reminder. One commentary said, Tyndall, that his stillness is not inertia, but concentration. And his patience gives opportunities to both righteous and wicked to show what they're made of. In other words, those times of adversity, those times of difficulty, you know what they reveal? They reveal what we're made of. And the wicked become more obvious who they are, and the righteous, it becomes what? More obvious who they are. Let me say this, for example. You go back to the days of Absalom. And again, I'm not 100% positive that's the circumstance in which it was written. Do you remember David had a close advisor by the name of Ahithophel? You know what Ahithophel did when things got difficult? He went over to King Saul. You know what the difficulty did? It showed who he was. You know who he was? I think Ahithophel was probably some guy he always was. He was about Ahithophel. He was about what was out for his interest. And the reason he was on David's side is, you know what? He knew at that point in time, we'd say where his bread was buttered. But when he thought it was better off for him to be over on Absalom's side, guess what he did? He changed side. Difficulties and adversity have a way of revealing our character. They show who we really are. And so David is looking at it and saying, you know what, God, I know you're in charge. And I may not always know why we're going through this, but I tell you what, I know that you test men and you see everything. You test the wicked, you test the righteous. Maybe this is a test that we're going through to see how we're going to respond. And I know that while you test the righteous, sometimes by allowing us to go through things that are painful and difficult, the wicked and the one who loves violence, what? His soul hates. How's God's attitude toward the wicked? He hates them. Sometimes we water down, I think, a little bit. You know, you ever heard somebody say God hates the sin, but he loves the sinner? Well, there's a sense in which that's true. God wants the sinner to be saved. He gave his son to die. But what's God's attitude when somebody's involved in wickedness? The book of Psalms and Proverbs and others said over and over again, he what? He hates the wicked. He hates the ungodly. Because why? Because they're ungodly. Doesn't mean he's not concerned about their soul, but because they have aligned themselves against him and against his way, the Bible said what? He hates the wicked. Upon the wicked, he will rain down fire and brimstone, and burning wind shall be the portion of their cup. Verse 5b and 6, and this is a reminder that occurs over and over again throughout Scriptures. Ultimately, everything is going to be what? Worked out. What's going to happen to the wicked? I mean, we look at it and we say, oh man, the wicked are in charge. I mean, it looks at times, as we said, like the inmates are running the prison. It just looks like the wickedness is prevailing. And the question is, you want to be in their shoes? No, why? Because at the end of the day, God's going to rain fire and brimstone down on the wicked. At the end of the day, they're going to be punished. Don't take right now the fact that wickedness is prevailing to be that God doesn't care or that God is not going to judge, because he will. The psalmist Asaph in Psalm 78, when he found himself envying the wicked, at the very end of that psalm, he said, then I considered their end, that they're in a slippery place. We said, Brother Bailey, last Sunday morning in this hour, talked about the rich man and Lazarus. Whose shoes you want to be in? Sometimes it looks like at that moment, oh, I'd rather be that rich man. Look at how great he had it. Whose shoes would you rather be in now? Because the reality is, ultimately, when one is living for themselves and not for the Lord, what's the ultimate end of that individual? They're going to fall. And so what David is saying is, don't tell me to run and to give my faith in God up. And it's, one thing I think David is saying, and I think this is a true point, ultimately, you can't run from your troubles. You know what? David could run. Do you think that dealt with the problem of Absalom or Saul? Saul went after him. He had to deal with Absalom and his trying. Sometimes people try to deal with problems by running from them. I'll just go somewhere else, or I'll do the, and at the end of the day, where do we have to turn to? God, to help us through the troubles. And I think that's what David is saying. I'm not going to run. I can't run from this. But here, what I can do, I can strengthen my faith by realizing God's in charge. God sees and tests the children of men. He knows what they're doing. He may be testing me even right now to see what I'm made of. He hates the wicked and will punish them. But the Lord is righteous, and he loves righteousness. What does it mean God's righteous? He always does what? What's right. He always does the right thing. And I know God always does the right thing. Here's what I know. God always does the right thing in answer to our prayers. Matthew 7, verse 11. I may pray for one thing, and God's answer may be what? Different. Who's right? God's right. He always gives the right answer to our prayers. He always does the right thing in the temptations he allows us to face. He always does the right thing in the chastening that he gives us. It's always for our good. And because I know God is righteous and God always does the right thing, what does that allow David to do? Turn to God and for refuge in the times of difficulty. And not only does God do what is right, what's his attitude toward the person that does what is right? He loves righteousness. He loves people that do the right thing. And then finally in verse 7, his countenance beholds the upright. That verse is translated two different ways. In my understanding, because I don't really know the Hebrew, know enough to be dangerous with it a little bit, it's translated one of two ways. The New King James, maybe the Old King James Version, says his countenance beholds the upright. And if that's the translation that is right, the idea seems to be that David is saying, I know God has his eyes and his face on those that are doing the right thing. God's looking after us. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 12. The eyes of the Lord are where? On the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. So if that translation is correct, that his countenance beholds the upright. The idea is God is looking at us. God has his eyes on us. God cares for us, and he's going to help us through, and he's going to do the right thing. The ESV, and I think probably the New American Standard, I'm not sure about the latter, translates it, the upright shall behold his face. And if that's the correct translation, and I think it probably is, the idea is that in contrast to the wicked, he's going to rain fire and brimstone down on. Ultimately, the upright will be where? They're going to be saved. We're going to see the Lord. Revelation 22 and verse 4, they shall see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. In other words, they're going to be with the Lord. They're going to behold his countenance. We sometimes sing the song, we shall see the King, what? Someday. That the idea is David is saying, I don't know how all of this is going to work out. I don't know the end result of this trial. But I do know this, the wicked are going to be punished, and the righteous will see the face of God someday. And because of that, then I can deal with this trouble and struggle. So, think Psalm 11 has anything practical for you and me today? To use, what do we learn that we take home that helps us in times of trouble?
Just keep on keeping on.
Keep on keeping on. Who's in charge of things? God is. God's in his holy temple. And so, come the Wednesday after Election Day, and whether we're excited or down, I tell you what I need to remind myself of, you know who's still on the throne? God is. I don't know how things are going to turn out, but I tell you what I do know. The wicked are going to be punished, and the righteous will see the face of God someday. That's what I know. And David said, because of that, I can get through this difficulty and this trial. Any other comments on that? Well, let's go to Psalm 52 real quick. Psalm 52. This is another circumstance in the life of King David. We come back, and this is a contemplation of David, or a maskil of David. What is the circumstance under which this was written? According to the heading. A man by the name of Doeg, who was an Edomite, tells Saul what? David has gone to the house of Abimelech. If you want to look at the historical circumstance, go over to 1 Samuel chapter 22. 1 Samuel chapter 22, what has happened? David is fleeing from King Saul. And in the midst of fleeing to King Saul, you may remember that David and his men had come to the priest at Nob. And in verse 9 here, verse 9, it says, Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And you may remember that, how did Saul respond to that? By the way, David went in 1 Samuel 21. What was Saul's response? When he found out that the word was, David's come to Abimelech, what did they do? They ended up killing the priest. In fact, you may remember that as the story sort of unfolds, that Saul gives the order to kill the priest, and his men what? They don't want to do it. I mean, these are the priests of God. These are God's men. And Doeg, who is an Edomite, who has no connection really with the people of God, he says what? I'll do it. And he killed the priest that David had fled to in 1 Samuel chapter 21. So when we come to Psalm 42, this is where the circumstance is. I take it that David has written this after the priests have been killed. And Doeg has shown his arrogance, that he's aligned himself up against the Lord. How do you think David probably was feeling at the time that he wrote this? Maybe a little guilty. I mean, after all, David had gone to the priest. David had eaten of the holy bread. I think it would only be natural for David to be thinking, what? You ever done this? If I hadn't done this, then maybe that wouldn't have happened. And so maybe David's saying, you know what, if I had never gone to Nob, to the priest, they would still what? They'd still be alive. Probably not only does he feel guilty, how else would he have felt? Probably angry. Would you be angry? I mean, these priests who had helped David, and David had lied, by the way, to the priest in the process of all of that, but they've been killed for no reason. I think, no doubt, you're angry with Saul. You're angry with Doeg. These men have elevated themselves above the Lord. So what do we have here in Psalm 52? You have the futility of boasting. And maybe particularly it is Doeg that this is directed to. Perhaps Saul is included in that. But he said, why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Your tongue devises destruction, like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, and lying rather than speaking righteousness. So he describes this godless boaster here in the first few verses. How would you describe him? He's somebody of some power. Some think that he has Saul in mind. Others that he has Doeg in mind. They're in union in this destruction that's taking place. What is their tongue doing? It's lying, working deceitfully. They'd rather speak a lie than to speak the truth. I mean, the reality is, what had David's relationship been with King Saul? From David, what had David done for King Saul or to King Saul? Not a thing. I mean, he'd been a faithful servant. He'd played the harp for him. He had delivered him from Goliath. David had been a faithful servant. What are they saying about David? That he's trying to take the throne away. I mean, even Saul had worked to try to turn Jonathan against David. It didn't work. Turn Michal against David. Here he's saying about this one, they've got the power, and it seems like they had rather lie than tell the truth. And then he says Selah, which means, think about that for a minute. Think about the kind of person we're talking about. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue. And so here's the liar that has positioned themselves against God, and they'd rather tell the lie than tell the truth. Their fate in verse 5. What's going to happen to them? God will likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. What's going to happen to the man that boasts against God and would rather hold on to falsehood than tell truth? They're going to be destroyed. God is going to destroy them. God is going to pluck them out of the land of the living. So verse 6, here he describes the response of the righteous. So I know this is what's going to happen. So what does the righteous do? How does the righteous respond to that fact? So here's David in response to what has happened in 1 Samuel 22. How should they respond? Number one, they shall what? See and fear. In other words, when I see what happens to the wicked, what should that cause me to do? Fear what? Well, what do you think that means to fear? Okay, in the sense of we respect God's power and we respect God's justice. I can remember more than one time when I was growing up, maybe one of us kids would get in trouble. It's usually one of the other ones, not me. But, they would get in trouble. And, it might be like if they're being disciplined for lying or they're being disciplined for something else, and the mom or dad spanks them and says what? Let that be a lesson to you. And I think that's what he's saying about the righteous. We'll finish this one up next week, and then we'll get into some of the other Psalms.